Welcome back to Eigen Designs. In some of my earlier videos, you saw me using a miter gauge to make my crosscuts. While a miter gauge certainly has a place in a woodworking shop, there's a better, more optimal way to make repetitive 90-degree cuts on a table saw. So today I'll be building my very own crosscut sled, and I'll walk you through the steps of how to make it and calibrate it. So stick around and let's get after it. Okay, so I've got a 3/4 inch sheet of plywood here that I've ripped to about 22 inches by 24. So we've got 24 inches this way, and we've got 22 inches this way. And I'm gonna be looking to make a crosscut sled. Now, I've got a job site table saw that is quite a bit smaller than a lot of the larger floor model table saws. And I see a lot of YouTubers out there with saw stops, and I get infinitely jealous, but this is what I've got to work with. And I would like to create a crosscut sled to help me cut some of my projects. So that's what I'm going to be working on today. So I've got two kind of grooves in my table saw, and we're going to be ripping a couple of smaller strips to put in these slots, and then I'll be placing this on top, and then we'll build the crosscut sled from the bottom up. To make the rails for the crosscut sled, I first tried using some plywood. In this particular case, I was using some 1/2-inch plywood. I never could get the fit to be quite right. It was a little bit too tall. I made a few attempts, but ultimately I decided to pivot away from plywood and use some leftover pine from a previous project. So I had some 1x6 pine that I cut into some strips. I first started with the exact width of the channel, and then I turned it on its side to get the right height that I was looking for. So there was a little bit more customization that I was able to do with the solid wood, and I was much happier with the final product in the end of the day, but it did require a little bit more work just to get these rails exactly right for my particular table saw. The next step is to attach the rails to the sled itself. To do this, I put some wood pencils in the grooves of the table saw as spacers so the rails stand proud of the table by about 1/8 of an inch. I then put some wood glue down and put the sled on top. The alignment is not important in this step because that gets addressed at a later step, but I did apply some heavy weight on top so that there was good contact with both of the rails. If you didn't want to wait around for wood glue to dry, you could use some faster acting CA glue and then come back later and reinforce with wood screws. Once that dried, I took it for a quick test drive, and everything seems to be working really well. To add some more functionality to the crosscut sled, I decided to embed some T-track in the board itself. I did this by setting the height of the table saw to the exact depth of the T-track and then running my board across the table saw to create some channels. And I actually cut the T-track to the length of the channels, leaving a little bit extra at the far end so that you can actually remove accessories once you take them in and out. But rather than screwing them into the very little material that's remaining at the bottom of the channel, I actually covered up the screw holes and decided to epoxy these in place. This to me was a better solution because it restored some of the rigidity back to the board, because once that epoxy hardens, it really fuses the metal T-track to the board and makes it a much more solid object again, and it eliminated the risk of having screws poke through the bottom of the board and actually scratch the channels in your table saw. With the base of the crosscut sled already cut, I turned my attention to the front and rear fence that's going to go on this crosscut sled. Now I want something a little bit thicker than 3/4 inch plywood, so you see me here ripping strips because I'm going to glue up 2 strips of wood together to make a 1.5 inch thick fence for the front of the crosscut sled and the back of the crosscut sled. Given that this project is not going to see any moisture, I'm using Titebond 1. If you had Titebond 2 or Titebond 3, that would work just fine, but I'm using Titebond 1 in this particular case. And because a woodworker never has as many clamps that they would like, you see me here stacking the 2 sets of wood on top of one another because I'm clamp limited and I didn't want to have to wait on the gluing process more than once. Now that we've got the sled and the railing lined up right above where the saw blade is, I can get a better feel for where we need to reinforce this railing. So if I come over, it doesn't have to be an exact thing, but kind of come over here, a little bit higher. That way you just got a little bit more material here because this saw blade is gonna penetrate pretty high up in this fence. With both fences marked up, I went over to the table saw and removed as much material as I could here. You see me here ripping off the waist edge on both sides of the fence. And then for the reinforced area, I took my table saw as far as I could on both sides before switching over to the jigsaw, where I finished off some of the more intricate cutting to create that nice rounded shape. After both fences were cut, I decided to install the rear fence first, since the alignment of this particular fence is not important. You'll never need to calibrate the rear fence for anything. It's really just there for structural support and to give you something to hold on to. I elected not to use any wood glue here in case I ever wanted to change out the fence, so I'm just using wood screws. With the rear fence installed, I just put it back on the table saw to make sure the crosscut sled was sliding freely and didn't encounter any issues, so I moved on to the front fence. After spending all that time and effort to make the reinforced area of the front fence, I realized that it actually created an interference issue with my flip stop for the fence accessory. So I'll explain that in a second, but I ended up having to do something a little bit different. If you look carefully, I really like the function of this T-track stop right here, because you can use it to make precision cuts over and over again, and this extruded aluminum allows you to bring up the edge of your material to make repeatable cuts. As I was making this, I didn't appreciate just how far this section right here overhangs into this. So what I ended up having to do is run this side through the table saw and cut off this piece that I worked hard to create. So it still exists on the other side. So what I did for this piece was create a separate raised piece of material here that was not quite as thick as the board, so that this particular piece could continue to travel freely. And as you can see, this just barely has enough clearance to fit. So I ended up having to do that off camera, but I just wanted to show you one of the clearance issues that I ran into. So after removing that reinforced area of the front fence, I decided to go ahead and attach the extruded aluminum piece to the front fence. I did so by using a couple of screws. I'm attaching this now because as we go to calibrate the crosscut sled in a later step, I'm going to be moving the wooden piece of the fence, and the extruded aluminum is going to be a part of it. So I don't want to go back and have to recalibrate once we attach the extruded aluminum. We're going to do this all as it's one piece. To begin the process, I take the front fence and line it up against the back edge of the crosscut sled. I use a square to make it as close to 90 degrees as I can with the existing table saw fence, and then I slowly pull it out and use some compression clamps to hold it in place while I can put a couple of screws on the back side. I'll be placing screws at either end of the fence. One screw is going to be designated as the pivot point, while the other screw is going to be for the adjustment. So as you go through the calibration process, if anything needs to be adjusted from the fence, you leave the pivot screw in place and you actually unscrew the adjustment screw and move the fence in the desired location. The objective of this process is that your fence of the Crosscut Sled is exactly 90 degrees to your table saw blade. One more step you need to take before you can calibrate your Crosscut Sled is to actually put the zero clearance channel where the saw blade is going to travel through. Now, whenever I took the footage for this, it came out really shaky, so I'm going to speed it up so I don't give anybody any seizures. But essentially what I did was just run it straight through from start to finish, even through the extruded aluminum. Now, I was a little bit concerned about this, but saw blade ended up being completely fine after making a pass through the extruded aluminum. To calibrate the Crosscut Sled, I used what's called the 5-cut method. And there's plenty of other videos on YouTube that can describe what the 5-cut method is. I would personally recommend one by a gentleman's name of William Ung, who does a very good job articulating this process. But in summary, you take a rectangular piece of wood and you undergo a series of 5 consecutive cuts, rotating the piece of wood 90 degrees after every cut. Once you're done with the process, the final piece would have magnified any discrepancies of the alignment between the fence and the saw blade by a factor of 5. So if it's off 0.1 degrees, by your final cut, it'll be off 0.5, so you can more easily identify any alignment issues. Once you have that information, you can then go back to your adjustment screw that we had put on the crosscut fence, and you can make the necessary adjustments, whether you need to swing clockwise or anti-clockwise. Once you make your final adjustments, you likely have to make a new screw hole so the screw doesn't go back into the same hole, and you repeat the process. And once you're comfortable with the alignment of the fence, you can then secure the front fence with a series of screws that never goes anywhere. Once the calibration process is complete, you can confidently put a straight edge on a project and know that it's 90 degrees to the side that you're referencing it against. So here's how the final product turned out. It took about 90 minutes of shop time if you include the time that I took to calibrate the Crosscut Sled, and you don't include the time that I spent waiting on the wood glue to dry. In terms of cost, with all the T-track accessories, the extruded aluminum, and the fence stop, it was probably $80 or so, give or take. Most of the wood that I used in this particular project was scraps that I had left over from other projects, so the minimal cost there, but some of these aluminum accessories got quite pricey. You certainly wouldn't have to use those if you didn't want to, but I found that they would be helpful for some of the project work that I do. My advice to any woodworker out there who doesn't currently have one of these, go and build yourself one of these because they are incredibly useful, and I wish I would have built mine a whole lot sooner. That's going to be it for this video. Give me a like if you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.